Welcome to the AFR Saints channel, where we provide you daily content on your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints. Do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. Be sure to leave your comments below and smash that like button. Who dat? Well, Jeff Duncan kicked the anthill this morning when everybody started waking up and checking Twitter.com, and there's this sort of cryptic tweet about it being a big day over on Airline Drive, and sure enough, it was. Pete Carmichael, after 18 seasons done in New Orleans. Jeff Duncan's good enough to join us for a couple of minutes here. As always, Jeff, we appreciate the time, man. How are you?
Doing good, Matt. How you doing, bud?
I'm doing well. Can you give us a sense of the timeline when the decision was made to part ways with Pete Carmichael?
Look, I don't know the exact time, but I'm sure it all occurred last week when Dennis Allen was holding kind of one-on-one meetings with Mickey Loomis. It's traditionally how they handle these end-of-season processes, and I'm sure they evaluated everything in the football operation, including the staff, and there's no surprise that this was the first day back for the coaching staff in the building today. So that's why the news came out today. Yesterday was a holiday. The coaches were all off last week. So it made sense for the shoe to drop today.
It does. And appreciate that context and clarification. That does make a lot of sense. Jeff, before you came on, I mentioned that you're the guy who quite literally wrote the book on the Saints offense. For those that haven't read Jeff's book, Peyton and Brees, the men who built the greatest offense in NFL history. You did not mention Peyton, Brees, and Carmichael, the men who built the greatest offense in NFL history. But Pete had some role, right? He had to have some role. So I'll ask you, the man who literally wrote the book, what was Pete Carmichael's role during these 18 years?
Yeah, it's a good question, Matt, and I think it's a good time to talk about that because Sean Payton has told me repeatedly that if he had to put a ranking of the most important people during his 16, 17 years in New Orleans with Drew Brees, that Pete Carmichael would be in the top 5. That's how important he was to what they did in New Orleans. He feels like he's the most unappreciated person in the building. And he basically was the liaison between Sean and Drew. I mean, he was the guy that held that together. I mean, you had these two incredible offensive minds, two incredibly driven, opinionated guys on how things should work. And Pete was kind of the glue. And, I don't think you can underestimate how important that was. The fact that those two guys never got into fights, never really had major disagreements in 16 years. I mean, I probed, when I was doing that book, I probed up and down over and over trying to find out when they had a falling out, when there was a breakdown. Then they all said no, it was because Pete Carmichael was there to smooth that over. So that's a very valuable role when you're talking about two of the greatest to ever, wear the black and gold.
He's on Twitter at @JeffDuncan_. So is it fair then, Jeff, to say that Carmichael was better writing sidecar to Sean Payton than he was as the guy sort of running the show offensively?
Oh, 100%. And look, I reported a couple of years ago, you may remember this, but Pete Carmichael, according to all my sources, didn't really want the offensive coordinator job. He understood that's a high-profile position. And I think people have to understand, the different nuances involved. With a guy like Pete Carmichael, he'd come here in New Orleans, really had no name, kind of worked his way up, and his family all grew up here, and they're very comfortable. His kids have all moved out. He doesn't need any more money. He's not seeking spotlight. He did not want that attention. This thing played out to all of his probably worst nightmares. All of a sudden, he's under the spotlight. He's getting blamed for everything. This is exactly what he didn't want. So, unfortunately, it didn't turn out the way I think anybody wanted on Airline Drive. But there's some culpability there, I think, in having him in that role. But the decision makers in New Orleans looked around and felt like he was the best person for them at that time. And they even looked around last year, Matt. I mean, after the first season, there was discussions behind closed doors. Do we need a new OC? And they looked around. I mean, they took a thorough search and were close to getting some other candidates in there, and it just didn't work out, so Pete stayed on. So this is something that's been kind of on the back burner for a couple of years. It's really no surprise this change was made.
So would you say Pete Carmichael was the problem, or has he just become the fall guy, the scapegoat?
Well, look, I think clearly he has to take responsibility when he accepts the job. You know, you have to coordinate that offense, and it's your responsibility to produce at a high level. And I don't think anybody that watched the Saints this year can say that, especially the first half of the season, that this offense was achieving its potential, especially with the talent that's there. They brought Derek Carr in, a ballyhooed off-season signing. One of the reasons they brought him in because he's familiar and likes the offensive system and comfortable in it. So this thing should not have taken as long as it did to kind of get turned around. And I think just the slow, kind of Titanic-like altering of courses, getting the play action system, implemented more often, getting some motion, going to make the changes along the offensive line. Everything seemed to take longer than it should have, and ultimately cost this team a playoff berth. Anybody that watched that game last night, I think, can see the opportunity that was lost to the Saints. I think everybody would agree that the Saints were every bit as good, if maybe not better, than the Bucs, but they didn't accomplish what the Bucs did, and that somebody's got to pay the price for that.
Just a couple more minutes here with Jeff Duncan, of course, on Twitter at Jeff Duncan _. Make sure you have the underscore at the back, or you get a whole different Jeff Duncan. Long story there, but anyway, Jeff, the story always becomes that, okay, well, we'll have time to reflect on Pete Carmichael's time in New Orleans, his legacy, his involvement in this great run, but obviously, who's next? So, I could leave it open-ended, but I want to start with a name because it was reported that the Saints met with John Gruden in Tampa a couple of weeks ago. Is that the most likely path they follow here to bring John Gruden to New Orleans?
I don't think most likely it would be the right way to characterize it. I do think he's under consideration and will be considered for some role with the team. What that is, I don't know. Whether it happens or not, I don't know. I think there's a lot on the table there. I think they're looking at all options. As I understand it, John Gruden wants to be a head coach in the NFL. That's what he's done for 2 decades, 2 different stops. That's his goal, to get back. Whether that happens or not, I think, remains to be seen, considering everything that's happened with him. He may have to get his foot in the door at a lower level, and that might be where a role on the Saints offensive staff or another team's offensive staff comes into play. But I know he is definitely under consideration, but it's very complicated with the John Gruden situation. So that's why I think more likely if he came into the Saints, it would in some other type of role on the offense, like a senior offensive assistant, the way Dennis Allen did a few years ago, as opposed to the OC, because I think the Saints need to strike quickly on that.
Well, then that's his path to being a head coach, same as Dennis Allen. Just come in as an analyst, make you the OC, and then you'll be the next guy. Could be.
You got it right.
Last thing, how desirable is the Saints OC job?
Well, there's only 32 of them, so there's always going to be a demand for that. But you make a good point. I think everyone in the league knows it's a make-or-break year coming up for Dennis Allen. That's not always the easiest backdrop to hire a top candidate. You have to look at the landscape around the league. We see it in the last week or so. Look how many jobs have turned over. So there's not a lot of job security for Dennis Allen right now. He knows that. This is the biggest hire he's going to make to save his job. The quarterback is his. The defensive staff he turned over a year ago, that's all his. Now he's turning over the offensive staff, and I think there's going to be some more names surface here in the next 24 hours on that staff. So this is it for Dennis Allen. He's got to nail this hire. And the thing that I think is most interesting, Matt, and I know we got to wrap up, but I asked him last week about this, and I put this on social media today. I asked him if he's happy with the offense, if he would consider a scheme change, and he indicated he thinks this offensive system, which is basically the Sean Payton offense, John Gruden offense, he thinks it's proven to work in the league. Now, does that mean that Mickey Loomis didn't tell him last week, nope, we need to change, let's open it all up? But just think about it logically. Your quarterback's worked in this system for a decade. You're the head coach. You got to win this year no matter what. Are you going to take that risk and bring in a whole new offensive scheme and staff and try and convert it to your quarterback? There's a lot of risk there. And I'm not saying it won't happen. They bring in somebody completely different, unfamiliar with the Saints offensive system. But just knowing Dennis Allen and how he's operated, I would lean more toward them finding someone either in the building to keep running this offense or someone that's worked in this system.
He is Jeff Duncan, CourseNola.com, on Twitter at @JeffDuncan_. Give him a follow. Big day down in New Orleans. We'll be following. Jeff, always appreciate you, man. Thanks for the time.
Anytime, Matt. Thanks for having me on, bud.
Hey, thanks so much for watching. Please leave your comments. I love to interact. And be sure to hit the red subscribe button below.